Okay, I think we're okay to go, right? Lucia, we're fine? Yeah. Okay, we have now 30 participants, so it's very nice. We'll start the second webinar of the GLP working group on socio-ecological land systems of Latin America. Today, the second webinar, we will talk about global markets, agreements, and impacts on land use conversions and on the environment. We have the pleasure, wait a second, I have to see if I can, yeah. We have the pleasure to have with us today 3 great speakers. We will have first Eugenio Arima telling us about Mercosur trade agreements if models are wrong in predicting deforestation in Brazil. Eugenio will be talking about 20 minutes, and then we will open some couple of minutes for questions of understanding very briefly, to then give way to our second team of presenters. We'll have Laura, Kehoe, and Tiago Reis that will be talking to us about stickiness and impacts of trade between the EU and Mercosur. They will also present about 20 minutes, and then after that, we'll have briefly again questions of understanding, and we will open up a discussion until we reach our hour. So it's a real pleasure to have these presenters with us. I'll briefly introduce you to them. So Eugenio is an associate professor at the Department of Geography at the University of Texas at Austin. He defines himself as a human environmental geographer with interest in understanding the motivation that drives humans to transform tropical landscapes. Laura is a postdoc at the University of Oxford and the Nature Conservancy in the UK. And she focuses in identifying policy levers along the food supply chains from deforestation, and she is also interested in human rights conflicts in Latin America. And Tiago is a doctoral researcher at the Catholic University of Louvain at the Faculty of Sciences, and he's analyzing the stickiness, and we're going to learn much more about that, what that means in agricultural supply chains, and he has interest in environmental policy and experience working in the Amazon and the Cerrado. And with that, I give you the screen, Eugenio. So the screen is yours. Oh, sorry, I had to, sorry, Eugenio, before you start, sorry, I forgot. 2 reminders. We are going to be recording this session. So please stop your microphones. The camera is up to you because only the camera of the presenter will be working. And we're going to have an interactive board. It's an interactive document where we would like to record your questions, so record by written, your questions and suggestions and concerns. The link is already in the chat. So you can use it. It's a Google document that will be there forever, where you can leave your comments and suggestions, and we will use it to check later on potential interactions we may have or interest of people. So with that, yes, sorry, Eugenio, you can start now.
Thank you very much, Lucia and Maria, for organizing this webinar. I will be talking about this trade agreement between the EU and Mercosur and the impacts on deforestation. As you can see by the title of the slides, the models, at least the ones that we are running, do not predict a very large effect on deforestation. So before I start, I would like to emphasize this is not a solitary work. I had several collaborators here from Brazil, Paulo Barreto in particular, from Purdue University. They were the ones who actually ran the Computable general equilibrium model that I'll be showing. And also people in Europe that helped gather a lot of data for the modeling effort. These are the main messages that I want you to stick with. Yes, the models do not predict much direct deforestation, but they are very likely to reinforce the inertial growth, which is huge in agribusiness in Brazil. Second, the spatial location, not only the amount of deforestation, but the spatial location of where deforestation might occur may be more important, particularly indigenous areas that are more likely to be threatened by deforestation. And as a caveat, the models that I'm showing are not dynamic, and I think there are opportunities here to understand what are certain dynamics that might impact land use, in particularly deforestation. I will focus my talk on the Amazon, but I will briefly show one slide of impacts in the Cerrado as well. This is a work in progress, so I'm still working on a manuscript on that, although a report is already circulating. To give you a brief overview and a little bit of background, Brazil, as you know, is a large exporter of agricultural and livestock products. And the growth here in tonnage, the red line here, it's more than linear, almost exponential. And if you look at the value, a huge growth in the 2000s during the commodity boom, and then it went flat after 2010 when prices crashed a little bit. Although I should say that in terms of local currency, because of devaluation, those values are actually higher. If you look at the beef market, it's the same trend. So a huge growth in exports, and this orange line here is the share of Amazonia beef exports, and it's also following the general trend of Brazil. The same is true for soy in Amazonia. Here's the planted area, again, following the trend of growth in Brazil as a whole. So what are some of the potential impacts of trade agreements on deforestation or land change in particular? Well, there are a few ways. First, of course, if you open markets to exports, you may have increase in agricultural prices that lead to changes in relative prices of land value and a reallocation of land use. And here, one example would be forests being converted to crops or pasture lands being converted to crops, etc. There are other ways as well. One in particular is usually when you open a country to trade, there is there's a potential, more competition, there's more investments, and productivity may increase. And paradoxically, as you know, you might have a negative impact when productivity increase through what is known as the Jevons paradox and actually have more deforestation. The trade agreements also may lower the marginal cost of agricultural land conversion. That's well known as the cheaper chainsaw hypothesis. If you have capital machineries, for example, that are cheaper, that will make conversion more easy, more cheaper and easier. And you may also have increased deforestation through local demand. Our models, I will not show here, but our models predict increase in welfare from trade. Here I'm defining welfare from the economic definition of welfare. And whenever you have increases in income or welfare, people will increase their demand for agricultural products, and that may lead to more deforestation. But the point here, those effects are very difficult to measure in general, because it depends on whether the countries are food importing or exporting, the level of protection prior to the free trade agreement, the relative prices of factor of production. So it's a very complicated set of conditions that drive those changes. And that's why we decided to work with the Purdue folks and do that modeling using a computable general equilibrium model. So there are two parts here to the modeling effort. One, that it's calculates the quantity deforested. This is given by the computable general equilibrium model. And then there's another part that it's the allocation, where deforestation is likely to occur. And this one was done by a spatial econometric model that I developed. So briefly here, we use the well-known GTOP bio model developed by Thomas Hertel. Many of you here know him, and it's a well-known model. I think it's the best general equilibrium model for the whole world, but because it has the social accounting matrix for the agricultural sector, it's very detailed, as well as for the policy analysis part. But in general, a general equilibrium model tries to mimic in a computer what happens in the global economy. And what it's nice about this model is that the agricultural sector is well defined, and also you can, one of the outputs is land allocation. So you can see whether there will be changes in land use in a particular country or region. Okay, so we'll not get into more details here, but if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer as far as my knowledge of general equilibrium models. Yes. We did several simulations here. On the columns here, you will see that there are scenarios of low deforestation and high deforestation, and also with double cropping or single cropping. All right, so double crop in Brazil, usually depending on the area, you can harvest, this is rain-fed agriculture, you can actually harvest two crops sequentially in certain regions because of the rainfall regime. So we did these different simulations here on the columns, but also on the rows here, we use different trade elasticities. These are called Hamilton trade elasticities, and essentially there's the standard here, GTOP, which is lower than what the current literature suggests, a higher trade elasticity. Essentially, it tells us how easily a country can switch its purchase from foreign markets of certain agricultural goods. A higher trade elasticity means that a country can shift quite quickly, and if international prices are cheaper, it will increase its imports. And I will show you only this last S23 scenario because that's the one that is the highest impact. I will focus more on the S23, high trade elasticities and single cropping. So essentially what we do here, we run the model once, which we call the baseline model with the current situation, the current tariffs and quotas, etc. And then we run with the new policies. And here we entered some of the policies that are under the agreement. I will not go through every single one of those, but I want to emphasize that the trade agreement is not really all that free. There's still certain quotas that will be in place. So for instance, the EU will eliminate import tariffs on certain amounts of ethanol, 450 tons of ethanol for chemical use only. Not for fuel, only 1/3 of the baseline tariff will include fuel, for example. Pork and poultry, we will also have some quotas, etc. So there are a bunch of quotas that will be tax-free, but beyond that quota, the things will still be taxed. Okay, and this is important because I think this is one of the key characteristics that may help explain the low deforestation scenarios. So this table here shows all the results from all the scenarios and by land type. And negative numbers here means that the land cover is going to diminish. So for instance, the worst case scenario, the S23 here at the bottom, forests in Brazil are projected to decrease by 172,000 hectares, okay? So these results are in hectares. And there will be loss of pasture lands that will also be converted to croplands, and there will be a gain in croplands of about 266,000 hectares in croplands. So not very large. As you may know, deforestation in Brazil is about this last year 10,000 square kilometers, which is 1 million hectares. So it's a much larger number than the ones. 1 year of deforestation is much larger than the trade agreement impacts. So what about the allocation? Again, I will not spend much time here, but this is based on a spatial explicit regression model where there is a regional effect here that is based on a auto-spatial regressive parameter here. And this is calculated using a Bayesian Markov chain approach. So, and the variables that we use to model deforestation are the ones that are usually used in that type of work: distance variables, conservation areas, indigenous lands, some physical variables such as rainfall, soil variables, and settlement projects, for example. I will not show the probabilities, but only where we think we ranked probabilities of deforestation and then picked the ones with highest probability and allocated deforestation until we reach the maximum here that is predicted. So this is where we predict to have deforestation. If you know the Amazon, these are well-known places. The southern part of Pará here is one, the central part of Pará as well is one hotspot. Northern Rondônia is another one, and northern Mato Grosso. So those are, I'm pretty happy with the way the model turned out in terms of allocation. We did also for the Cerrado, and the same here, the Matopiba area. This is the new frontier in the Cerrado. We predict a lot of deforestation as well as northern Mato Grosso. So when we look closely here, in particular in the Amazon, we can see, for example, this area that it's near, this is what is known as Terra do Meio area, is one area where we predict lots of the most likely deforestation to occur. And this is unfortunate because this is an area that has lots of indigenous lands as well as national parks. And as you may be aware of, there is a move to weaken the protection, particularly in indigenous lands, and allow different sorts of commercial economic exploitation of those lands. So this is worrisome. So there are a few things here that the model doesn't capture. The computable general equilibrium model is static in a sense that we compare two static periods before and after the policy agreement. But work that I did with Peter Richards, we showed that, for example, farmers reinvest lots of their profits and expand production. So we calculated, for example, that every $10 billion in profits, you could have up to 760,000 hectares in additional area plan. So this reinvestment in agriculture is something that we should look at more closely if the trade agreement comes into fruition. So, another question is, the trade agreement, on the other hand, maybe have its positive side as well. Some folks believe, for example, that European consumers will be more vigilant in terms of what they are purchasing. And the idea is that they are more environmentally conscious and they will put pressure on the supply chain to be more sustainable. So in the long term, they believe, well, if Brazil relies more on the European market, that might be something good in the future. So to conclude here, my time is up. The EU-Mercosur trade agreement may not cause much direct impact as long as quotas are in place. This is important to emphasize. And it seems consistent with other studies that have been published, at least reports that have been published, one by the University of Bern and the London School of Economics as well. But it may increase capital surpluses and maintain the initial growth of agribusiness. And finally, the where might occur deforestation, particularly in the Amazon. I think that's something that we should be a little concerned, particularly because of the political situation in Brazil. Thank you. I think I managed to keep my time, and I'll be happy to entertain questions later.
Thank you very much, Eugenio. We said we will have a couple of minutes to take questions on understanding, and you can keep your more general questions leading us to a discussion for the end after the presentation of Tiago and Laura. So if there's any pressing question on something that was not very clear, feel free to unmute your microphone and ask it. Or you can also write it in the chat. I can also read it out loud. I don't see everybody, so I don't see if they're raising hands. Feel free to unmute your microphone. No questions? Then we can continue with Laura and Tiago, if you want to share your screen. And then after this presentation, then we will open up the discussion. I can use the time to remind those that join a bit later. We have a Google document open and live where you can also type your concerns, suggestions, or ideas you want to share with us. And it's going to be kept alive for the lifetime of this working group. So feel free, the link, it's already in the chat and it's editable now. So Laura, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Maria. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Eugenio. That was a really interesting talk. It was already answering a lot of questions that I've had running through my head for the past year or two. So thank you for doing that work. So I'm going to talk briefly about the impacts of trade between the EU and Mercosur bloc and speak a little bit about the policy perspective of what we can actually do to potentially avoid these impacts or use trade as a kind of a leverage point in this complex system of quite often terribleness. So trade globally, it's a mess. about 1/4 to 2/3 of all anthropogenic, like land use, deforestation, emissions, they're all embodied in these global trade flows. Nobody's really taking responsibility for them though. And many people aren't even aware of them. Like awareness of Europeans of the impact of their food, it's gone up quite a lot in the past few years, but it's a relatively recent thing. The EU-Mercosur agreement, thank you again, Eugenio, for introducing this. So I don't need to talk so much about what it is and where it came from, except to mention that the EU is Brazil's second largest trade partner. But of course, unbridled trade can have all of these impacts on indigenous people's lives, local communities, and deforestation. And I apologize if you see here the EU, this infographic was made before Brexit, so I need to like color the UK a little bit differently now. Anyway, so a quick overview of the major commodities that are causing destruction that the EU is importing. They're really, if you want to pick the top 3, I would say it's beef and soy right now, and in the future, potentially ethanol. And that's because we're already importing over 200,000 tons of beef into the EU, with a quota of 99,000 tons that Eugenio gave more details on. There's questions, as Eugenio kind of touched on, about whether or not that would actually increase the overall trade amount after the agreement would be passed. There's no new quota for soy, but we're already importing a huge amount of soy in order to feed to European animals. So over 10 million tons of soy imported, currently tariff-free, but of course there's questions around the export taxes. And then there's the new quota in the Mercosur agreement, which wasn't mentioned much in the media, of 650,000 tons of ethanol. So we're only importing around 50,000 tons annually right now. So that's like the sort of really big overview of the major things that we're importing. And as you already very likely know, beef and soy are the #1 drivers of deforestation in the Mercosur bloc. And so the impacts of this are huge already. So already every 3 minutes, the EU imports 1 football pitch of deforestation from the Mercosur bloc. So since I've been talking, that's 1 football pitch gone. And I mean, you can see that as not a lot if you look at like the amount of football pitches that have gone, or you can see it as an insane amount that we shouldn't be responsible for in a world that's already on fire, right? Like you can see it from either direction, I think. 120,000 hectares per year, that translates to, if you want the overall numbers. And so as Eugenio mentioned, that so if the deal was passed, that would be an additional 172,000, as I understood it. So quite a lot on top of what to me is already something that the EU needs to fix urgently, given that the Amazon rainforest is edging towards a tipping point, which could shift entire regions into more like a savanna state, releasing huge amounts of carbon, causing species extinctions and destroying local communities' lives. And this is a really big point here. I mean, if the Amazon shifts, it's also going to ruin agriculture in the region, because most agriculture relies on rainfall that's created in the Amazon. So it's also a kind of a really insane shoot yourself in the foot kind of scenario. Murders of indigenous leaders in Brazil is also skyrocketing since Bolsonaro was elected. We've had an increase in violence against indigenous people and local communities. And that's a really serious issue that doesn't get enough attention. And it's ongoing, again, even before a trade deal. So because of all of this, myself and some trusted colleagues like Tiago, who will be speaking soon, put together a letter calling on the EU to make trade with Brazil sustainable. And we got the support of the Indigenous Articulation of Brazil, so representing over 300 indigenous groups in Brazil, calling on the EU to do better. The EU did not do better, and they sort of made a provisional trade agreement with the Mercosur bloc, and it didn't really include what was needed in order to ensure that trade wouldn't fuel further damage. So we then wrote this paper looking at what would be needed actually in a trade agreement in order to ensure that damage wasn't done to local communities or the environment. And so we have these kind of three major tenets of what we envision to be sustainable trade. However, I should mention we're mostly, you know, white people in Europe who aren't actually on the ground and aren't actually most vulnerable to these impacts. So one of the most important tenets here is that we shouldn't make up these rules. The inclusion of the most vulnerable communities should be a very strong tenet in order to not overlook those voices that are not being heard right now. The second tenet is transparency for high-risk commodities across supply chains. So right now, we don't actually know where our products are coming from when we see it, you know, in EU supermarkets. There's no transparency there. And enforcement, so the enforcement of binding legislation, so that we actually, when we break the rules, there's some kind of ramification there, right? Right now, there's nothing in the current trade agreement to actually enforce anything properly. There's no details on that given. So the trade agreement fails on these three tenets that we've laid out. It also fails to meet the goals of the European Green Deal. So the goals are no net emissions by 2050. Well, beef is one of the highest emissions in the world from the Mercosur bloc. So not really fitting into that goal very well. The second goal, economic growth decoupled from resource use. Well, that's kind of a dream. It's never been shown. Helmut Haberl has a great paper out showing that this has never been achieved in any system to date. And I also have a paper looking into biodiversity policy beyond economic growth. Specifically in this case, there's a substantial risk that economic growth will come at the expense of local communities, natural habitat, and the global climate stability. And then the third beautiful goal of the Green Deal, no person and no place is left behind. Lovely. Maybe try talking to local communities then when you make these huge deals. I'm sorry, I know I'm not giving a very scientific tone here, but I am tired. I am tired of this. I'm tired of reading about this legislation that looks good, but isn't binding, right? Big words, and at the end of the day, we just see these ongoing impacts. Sonia Guajajara is the leader of the Indigenous Articulation of Brazil, an amazing woman, and she suggests 2 clear benchmarks before considering ratifying any new trade deals. So before even considering ratifying this deal, not anything to do with inclusion in the deal, just don't even talk deals until these things are done. The first is progress for ending impunity for violence against forest offenders, as measured by the number of cases investigated, prosecuted, and brought to trial. And the second is reducing deforestation rates in line with the Paris Agreement. So Brazil has already agreed, in the case of Brazil, for example, to reduce deforestation, and it's going in the opposite direction. So that could be a really big way to turn around the direction of these things in line with what the country has already agreed to. So I hope I gave you a very quick overview of sort of the issues with trade and the potential solutions, the amount of money and power wrapped up in trade, and how it could actually be used as a leverage point for tipping things in potentially a brighter direction. Naive as it may sound, it's to me a potential option that has been largely overlooked. And I will now pass the floor to Tiago, who's going to talk about stickiness in the geographic sourcing patterns of companies engaged in commodity supply chains and how these sourcing patterns might affect local realities. So I hope you can share the screen, Tiago, and give us a little bit more of a nuanced view. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you very much. Thank you, Eugenio, as well, for the excellent presentation, like bringing some perspectives and numbers to us. So I'm going to talk a bit about this stickiness, this notion, which I would like to add into the discussion and to use it as a lens to analyze what are the potential impacts and what are the potential outcomes in terms of socioeconomic development, land use, trajectories, etc. So first of all, this notion of stickiness refers to this idea of the stability of supply chain relationships. So we look at this considering supply chain relationships or commercial transactions as a network. And then these network configurations between places of production and trade, companies, country destinations, if they are maintained over time and across perturbations, we call it sticky. If it is disrupted or if it's shifting, reconfiguring, we call it non-sticky. And then there are some layers, but I'm not going to enter too much into details here. Basically, this is just a way to calculate some factors that are somehow embedded in trade relationships, but we cannot measure because somehow they are intertwined and they are also qualitative. So as I like to say, stickiness is not an end in itself, but it is a proxy for many processes that take place in localities, in local productive landscapes. So this is the way we measure it, which is basically using this topological overlap and temporal correlation coefficient from network analysis. These are the way to measure. But just to give a very synthetic expression for what stickiness represents, it basically represents lock-in effects, trust, and also supply chain power and dominance. So these are the three main aspects that we can see manifesting quantitatively through stickiness. And that's why we want to put forward this as a notion, as a method, and also as an additional indicator to consider in these supply chain relationships with land use. This is the measurement we conducted of the stickiness between producer municipalities, soy producer municipalities in Brazil and soy traders. And here, as you can see, these reddish municipalities are those that were stickier in their relationships and their supplying relationships with traders. So to understand this, let's consider the municipality as if it is a producer, a farmer. Of course, it is the aggregate of farmers because we are not going to the farm level, but this is the municipality level. And then we are looking at the relationships, the commercial relationships between these municipalities and the exporting traders. So these reddish municipalities, they mean that over time, between 2003 and 2017, which was the observed period, these municipalities, they were more or less stable. They traded, they supplied soy to more or less the same traders. The yellow ones, in contrast, are those municipalities that had rather volatile relationships, which means the traders that came to source from these places were shifting over time. Then we already tested this indicator with other metrics, which is the adoption of zero deforestation commitments and also the impacts on overall deforestation, the soy driven deforestation. So the preliminary findings so far is that stickier traders are more likely to adopt zero deforestation commitments. We found that in our model. And also when we combine these zero deforestation commitments with stickiness and look at stickiness as a moderating factor of the impact of the ZDC, we see that it seems to increase overall deforestation. So basically, while we see that the zero deforestation commitment decreases direct supply chain, soy-driven deforestation, overall it increases. So there is a likelihood to be a leakage occurring in these processes. And also when we look at stickiness alone, it increases deforestation even more significantly. The potential explanation for this that I am reflecting and analyzing from fieldwork and from qualitative analysis, semi-structured interviews that I've been conducting in 6 different soy producer regions in Brazil, is that these stickier traders, they also bring more credibility, more trust. And once they settle into these frontiers, they issue this signal to local actors that they should, or they should feel confident to deforest, to prepare land, to produce soy, because they will have a credible, a trustworthy trader to supply to. On the other hand, when you have non-sticky or volatile traders settling into these frontiers, the local actors, they don't perceive this credible signal. So they remain reluctant to invest in more deforestation, in more land preparation and increasing production. But this is something for discussion, of course. And then on another research stream we've been conducting, we looked at some of these impacts of soy exports on the Brazilian Cerrado and analyzed these exclusionary development patterns. So here, I just want to bring some photographs and some direct quotes from the actors that we interviewed on the field. And we have been seeing some, I'm going to jump because I'm running out of time. So we've been observing impacts. As we know, Mato Piba region in Brazil is a large exporter, especially to the EU. Also the overall stickiness average that we measured in there is actually super high. So it is a deforestation frontier with high stickiness in the supplying relationships between the municipalities and the traders, which means that these traders actually, they are pretty much engaged and related to whatever happens in these regions because they don't have shifting sourcing patterns. So as a result, we've been observing these type of impacts like on water security, decreased water availability, restricted physical access to water sources in privatized areas, contamination. In terms of food security, we've been seeing disruption of traditional farming systems, the die out of native edibles, undermined local income sources and economic access to food. In terms of land rights, lots of impacts as well, because when soybeans arrive into the region, it puts more pressure on land speculation, on land trade, and many lands that usually were not valuable, they become valuable. And if these traditional communities living in these lands, they don't have land deeds or the titles, these lands become very disputed and these communities end up being displaced or moved to other regions. And then also some issues related to governance participation, because these local perspectives are not being represented in these multi-stakeholder fora. Even these environmental governance forum, like the soy working group, which is the responsible for the Amazon soy moratorium, and also in these discussions to expand the soy moratorium to the Cerrado, these local perspectives have not been included in these discussions. So as we see, these local and traditional people perceive themselves as big losers in the process. The benefits are not being perceived as worth the troubles and losses. Traditional livelihood strategies are being disrupted. Water cycles are being disrupted. As I said already, participation in social environmental governance fora is not being sufficient. There has been lots of communities displacement. And yeah, and so the very issue here is that when we associate increased trade, frontiers, and stability in supply chain, we are not having the very positive or constructive outcome we would like to see. So we need to address some of these issues, because if we see stability of supply chain in consolidated regions, then we see development. But if we see stability in non-consolidated or frontier regions, we don't see this inclusionary development. So yeah, this is basically what I would like to bring for reflection. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tiago. Thank you, Laura. Very interesting presentations, also together with Eugenio, I think it brought a very interesting picture on trade and impacts of trade, specifically focusing in Brazil, in some regions of Brazil. We have around 15 minutes now. We can open up first if there are a couple of questions on understanding, and if not, we can open up the discussion. Please feel free to unmute your microphone. We can start with questions of understanding for any of the three presenters. Otherwise, we can jump into the questions for discussion. And I don't see all of you. We have many participants today. It's a great pleasure. So feel free to unmute your microphone if you have a question. Anyone that wants to break the ice?
Hi, I'll break the ice.
Thanks.
I'm Victoria Junquera. I'm calling in from Zurich, and I'm at ETH in Zurich. I had a question for Professor Arima. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I was just wondering if the modeling approach that you've used based on GTAP and then on spatial allocation, if you have validated this approach with data from the past, that's one of the questions. Meaning not your current work, because your current work predicts deforestation for the future, but has this approach been validated in other areas of the Brazilian Amazon in the past, and how has it performed? And the other question is, for the spatial allocation, you cited a number of parameters. And I was wondering, are these based on literature, or are these based on actual, deforestation instances in the past that say that these are the relevant parameters? Thank you.
Thank you. The GTAP is well known among modelers of land use change, in particular when there's trade involved. And it's really the benchmark of all the models. And it has been used quite often in different ways. For the Brazilian Amazon in particular, how it works is you model first the benchmark. According in this particular work, we model the situation as it was in 2016. So you model the benchmark and then model the changes in policy. And the difference is what we model. So it's really only the impact of policy change that we are trying to see. So we keep everything else constant, change only the trade agreement part, and see what's the difference in land use. All right. So we published a paper with Peter Richards, who's here as well, on the impact of the trade war between the United States and China and its impact in Brazil, because China levied taxes on soybeans imported from the United States, and in turn shifted its imports to Brazil. We also didn't find a huge impact, and based on what I spoke with producers in Brazil, that's exactly what they were thinking. In other words, they said, well, for us, it didn't change much because we know that that situation might change day to day. So we are really not much concerned about these changes in trade agreement. What they told us is that the overall market, export market, is good because of productivity gains in Brazil was huge in the past few decades. And there's also cycles of exchange rates that are very important. And currently for the past 2 years, 1.5 years, the exchange rate in local currency is really good. So although international prices have plateaued, the exchange rates are very favorable. So what they are looking for are these more macro types of scenarios. So my point here is that I think the models are right, but I can't say for sure. Only time will tell. And the overall dynamics, I think, is favorable, not only because of the EU trade agreement, but the overall trade dynamics is favorable to exporters. As the other second part, yes, those are based on literature. Those are the usual variables that people use in modeling. These particular regression-based models. We can talk later. I don't want to eat all the time up here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions there? If not, I have a question myself for Tiago. I found very interesting what you mentioned on the potential leakages, and I was wondering if you reflected on which, but also where this potential leakages could be happening from what you presented, and which can be the potential impacts there, if they are similar to those that you presented on water security or food security, or if they could be other hidden ones that you may be speculating on.
Yeah, I see, as far as I can see, the leakage follows the infrastructure and technology tracks, right? So all the areas that have suitability, then infrastructural capacity, and then technology, which also changes the suitability factor, will receive this deflection of deforestation for production, as far as I see. So politically speaking, the soy moratorium was only feasible to be approved by companies because, I mean, some people have this reading, and I concur with them, is that there was suitability given by new technological factors and also infrastructure in the Cerrado. And therefore, the soy moratorium was politically feasible to be approved. Of course, economically as well, but politically, if you consider discourses and all those narratives around the Cerrado that is not super valuable as an ecosystem, all these things are changing right now, but this was stronger back there in 2004, 2005, and 2006 when the agreement was first signed. And the same happens for the Chaco, for Chiquitano, for all those South American regions where soy is expanding. And it may also become true in Africa as soon as new technological factors are being developed. And currently there are issues with governance, with political stability and infrastructure in there. But as soon as these issues are overcome, then probably we'll watch leakage to Africa as well. So yeah, I don't know if I fully responded your question, but.
Yes, definitely. I see, Eugenio, you raised your hand, right? Do you want to contribute?
Well, yes, I remember something that it's important. It's related to Victoria's question as well. Something that the models don't account for because it's not part of Brazil's policy yet is capital investment. Brazil has a very constrained land policy, which doesn't allow foreigners to invest in land in Brazil. But there is talks in Congress going on to change the legislation and allow foreign investors to actually purchase land and run agribusiness in Brazil. If that changes, then it's a whole lot different scenario, because in general, those computable generic living models, the impact of capital is huge on land change. So if that changes and foreigners are allowed to invest in land in Brazil, that's a completely game changer.
Thanks. We have a couple of more minutes if you want to raise your hand or make another question. Scroll through people in case anyone would like to. Or your microphone if you want to ask. Otherwise, I would like to throw a question to Laura regarding what Eugenio previously said about the small influence of these trade agreements on potential impacts, or not only impacts on the production, especially with the EU. I was wondering, what's your take on that? If really the EU agreement with Mercosur is not going to have such a big impact on the land or land use changes. I mean, the other figures point at the different situation, right? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's down to a lot of the points that Eugenio has also brought up, that we don't include so many of these potential knock-on effects. We don't look at the areas that are being deforested and the risk to local people there. We don't think about the leakage effects. I think overall, the main point for me is that if we agree to this deal without actual decent sustainability criteria, but to me anyway, we're hammering a final nail in that coffin, because in terms of global players shifting trade towards a direction of sustainability, the EU holds a lot of power there right now. And so it's like a huge missed opportunity in this global attempt to not, reach these catastrophic climate change tipping points. So it's like there's an opportunity there to say, okay, we're not going to consider this trade deal unless Brazil turns around and meets its own Paris Agreement. Like, for me, that's the big loss. If we lose that opportunity, then we lose so much in terms of future trajectories of entire regions. I think that's, for me, the real impact, rather than the 170,000 hectares annually. Even though just taking that, if you multiply that over 10 years, and if you think about how close the Amazon could be towards a tipping point, that's still considerable, right? Like, I don't want to sort of undermine that either, but it's the larger picture of global players and political decisions that I think there's opportunity there that hasn't been looked at. Really quickly, like, there's a protest in Dublin today about not importing LNG, natural gas, that's come from fracked areas. There's a protest about that because people know about it. There's not enough attention or pressure on importing these foods that are causing this kind of deforestation and destruction. So I hope that answers the question more or less.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, and that claims on responsibility, right? On the responsible consumption. And we have Eugenio was answering. We had Bill McConnell in the chat saying that there's a big company owning farmland in Brazil, where most US academics have their retirement investments there. So that's related to this responsibility, but also knowing, right, where your investment funding is going. I'm just reading out loud, and okay, there's being a discussion in the chat now. It's going to be fast about this investment in Brazil and funds. You can read it, but there. Last question. It's already o'clock, wherever you're sitting in the world. If there's a last pressing question, I hope speakers can still take it. Otherwise, we may close the discussion for today. If not, okay, discussion continues in the chat. Feel free to stay if you want. Otherwise, I wanted to share with you one last time my slides. Sorry. To make some announcements. We're gonna have 2 upcoming activities of our working group in May. We're organizing a meet and greet event for the working group, and everybody's mostly welcome the 5th of May, where we will have several interactive breakout rooms where we would like to get to know each other and get to know our potential collaboration opportunities that may arise among the members of the group. If we find common topics where we are working or we would like to be working. And this will be a longer session. We may take a couple of hours for that. It's more for interacting with each other. And then a third webinar at the end of May on capitalism and trade in the development of South America, where we will have two well-known GLP members, Ignacio Gasparri and Graciano Sedia, that will be talking about a bit of trade and development and poverty in South America for Gasparri, and the ecology of capitalism for Graciano Sedia. This will be also a longer webinar of a couple of hours because the presentations and the discussions are, we believe, will be a bit longer. So you're very welcome to join. You can register already online in the website of the working group. And with that, I would like to thank you, all of you, for being there. It was really a pleasure having so many participants today in the webinar. This open Google document will stay there in case you want to note down a couple of ideas or further questions you may have. We're happy to pass them on into presenters, or you can, of course, contact them directly. And you know where to find us as well. So stay healthy and see you in the next webinar. Thank you, everybody, for being there, and for the presenters, especially for the effort of today. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thanks, Maria.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.